So I just wanted to welcome you all to our space, and I actually just wanted to start off with a territorial acknowledgement. So in keeping with regional protocol, I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee by honoring the sovereignty of the 6 nations, Mohawk, Cayuga, Onondaga, Oneida, Seneca, and Tuscarora, and their land where we are situated and where the majority of this work took place. In this acknowledgement, we hope to demonstrate respect for the treaties that were made on these territories and remorse for the harms and mistakes of the far and recent past. And we pledge to work towards partnership with a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. So if you or your organization are interested in that, it is available in our digital commons from our Indigenous Peoples fact sheet. But Nyaway Snego Krikishpanyets, or Kristin Ksiazek now, Ni Gieso Onondawaga Ni A. I'm Kristin Ksiazek. I'm Seneca Hot Clan and also very Polish. And I work on Buffalo Commons, which many of you are familiar with, but I see a couple new faces, so I'll share a little bit more about that. So we try to do a few different things. My role is a joint collaboration between Cornell ILR here in Buffalo and Partnership for the Public Good. So one of the things that we do is we house and curate a digital library that's available on Cornell's website to all the really great folks and students there. And it's housed on PPG's website, so it's available to the 295 partners who want to make use of all the resources that are produced about Buffalo Niagara region. So if you or your organization or any of the researchers that you work with have any reports, resources, information that needs to be made available to the public about this region, we're more than happy to share those with our partners. Second, we host a researchers network. So that's over 180 researchers who are currently or who have done Buffalo Niagara focused research. So they're from Cornell, and so many of you may know, and we've shared in this report, there's over 21 higher ed institutions here in the region. So we're lucky to act as a convener for a lot of them, but there's also really great folks doing a lot of really great work across this network. And finally, we host workshops. This one's a little bit unique. Where we try to take the research and make it available to those who would really want to know the information or use it, who are doing the really great work. Again, just to reference everyone here, you're like, who is doing all of this really amazing work? This person. So we have a really extensive panel of rock stars here, so I just wanted to thank them all for joining us. But the ultimate goal for these workshops is to help people make really informed decisions, whether it's policy, whether it's their organization, or workplace, or whether it's just education. So we're going to turn it over to what we're doing here today. Normally I don't say too much, but I'm really excited about this specific report that I had the chance to work on. Distinguishing the social sector of Buffalo Niagara labor market studies doesn't really roll off the tongue, so I'm going to share a little bit more about it. But the idea for this study came from a variety of things. The first is really the changing world of work. So the first thing we thought about here, and it's something that we look at a lot, is technology. So oftentimes people think about automated machinery, doing a lot of different jobs that people do. Maybe it's apps related to the gig economy or computer and voice automation. I just maybe 2 days ago was on a call that took a little bit longer than it needed to. So we know that a lot of these technologies really can't replace people, and we'll share more about those things later in the study. But work is also changing in a variety of other ways that don't relate to technology, and one of them is people's responses and ways that people organize. So I don't know if you heard on the radio this morning, protests going on related to certain plants around the country. And our New York State Lieutenant Governor talked about this is one of the most unionized places and one of the most unionized states. And so there's a lot of ways that people here in Western New York know how do you get your voice as a concerned citizen and as a worker heard. Well, we wanted to explore this as it related to other areas that maybe didn't have to do with manufacturing, since specifically this area has seen a significant shift in the types of jobs that are available. So we wanted to know, what does that mean? What does that look like? How has the economy changed over time? So not to say that there aren't other studies, there are a lot of other studies, but we wanted to zoom in on this specific sector. So what does the social sector mean? This was actually, and I'll share a little bit more about it, what does this social sector mean? Well, here at PPG, again, over 290 different partners, block clubs, unions, institutions of higher education, service providers, formal and informal. So some of them are registered with the IRS, some of them aren't. But there's narratives about Buffalo that has a lot of eds and meds, which are, in fact, that we found to be true, but we also wanted to dig a little bit deeper. And then the last part, and I think this is one of the most important parts, as the title said, we really wanted to distinguish it. So there's been a lot of studies done about the region. A lot of for-profit organizations can pay for studies that examine their sector and can make informed decisions based on those studies and based on that information and data. So we wanted to do something similar to help a lot of the partners and a lot of the government entities and establishments that we work with make those similar informed decisions as it relates to skills, as it relates to the number of jobs and trends over time. So we wanted to also look at where the strengths and challenges lie. I personally became really interested in this too. We talked with another organization that worked with big data. So I've read maybe several different studies that talked about, oh, we used this to examine the labor market because we analyzed it across the globe and then in this region. And I was like, well, that's interesting, and I wonder if any of our partners have done that. So we asked around, and none of them have really heard of burning glass technologies or utilized big data, and so we were curious, could we look and use big data, this type of technology, to help inform our study? And then I'll share a little bit more, and then I'm going to toss it over to our really great folks to share about some of the findings. So normally reports are really interesting because of what's in it, and I'll say that undoubtedly that's true for this study. I promise we didn't just release a 68-page document that's not interesting. I spent a lot of time working through it. The findings are really important and will be shared today, but the process was almost equally as important as the product. So first we had to define the social sector, and defining the social sector, we know that there's a distinction to be made between establishments whose work is driven by profits and all those others that aren't. So in our mind, that was one of the questions that we dealt with, and we read through the literature and tried to figure out, well, what does that actually mean in real life? So what that meant in real life and for this study is that we were really going to focus on nonprofits, again, looking at IRS, how that's defined by the IRS, but also government, which in a lot of people's minds might not coincide, and we'll get to that in a little bit as well. So we looked at those things, and specifically, again, for this study, we looked at paid employment. So there's a lot of nonprofits, there's a lot of work that's being done that's driven by volunteer work, or that doesn't concern paid employees. So we really wanted to focus in on that, and we can have a whole separate conversation about volunteers in a second, but remind me, we can come back to that. The second interesting finding was data availability. So there's a lot of traditional channels for acquiring data. We recently just did a union study, and so I felt really confident in working through these data sets. But then I went and I looked for this information for these specific sectors, and I remember I went home one day and my partner was like, "You look a little frazzled, did something happen? Like, what is going on?" And so I told him, I was like, well, I might have been pulling my hair out all day because finding this information was really hard. And so, and I'm sure Rusty will share a little bit in a second, but finding all the information in one place, it didn't happen. So we pulled data and information and defined it in different ways based on what was available for us. So that's an interesting finding in and of itself. Finally, we just wanted to make this report useful for a lot of different people. Again, we here try to make reports accessible to people who will use them. So it could be policymakers, it could be community organizations, it could just be the public. So you'll see it feels really thick and heavy, but there's a lot of appendices, so don't be intimidated. The first few pages have really great executive summary. That you'll find a lot of the information, but if you want to dig deeper, each of the sections shares a little bit more about that. So just wanted to note that. So without further ado, I'm actually going to kick it off to our panel. So we're just going to go down the line maybe this way. Just introduce yourself, the organization that you work with, and then Rusty will start with sort of his 5-minute talk about the findings, and then I'll ask each of you to share a little bit more about your work as it relates to K-12 preparation, mindsets, skills, and how we measure and evaluate the impacts of these different types of organizations. So, Curtis, want to kick us off?
Great. Good afternoon, everyone. Curtis Robbins with the John R. Oishei Foundation, Director of Strategy, Research, and Evaluation. So basically, everyone comes to me when they want to know something, and then I, of course, pick up the phone and call Kristin some of the time. So it's been an excellent partnership. And I'm excited to, of course, review the report, but at the same time, I want to acknowledge PPG just from the standpoint of their thought leadership in this and being able to take this information and share it with the field. I think that's really important if we're really committed to driving change in this community.
My name is Tommy McClam. I'm the Director of Boys and Men of Color Initiative and Mentoring over at Say Yes. And it's my first, when I actually looked at the report and started going through, thinking my first thought was, how do I distill it down to the population of young people that I actually deal with? How do we get it to the place where it becomes useful and understandable for them? And so, once again, thank you for the report. But then also, on the other side of my head, I was saying, gee, it's a lot of work. All right. But I think overall, looking at it, it calls me to look at when we talk about the social sector and looking at how our young people fit into that work.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. My name is Franchelle Parker, Executive Director of Open Buffalo. Most recently, we've really been hyper-focused on utilizing leadership development opportunities and fellowships as a workforce development tool, and really looking to remove the barriers to work, mainly around women re-entering into the workforce development and looking at childcare issues. So again, another tool to help us have the conversation. So we're super excited about that. Thank you.
Katie Pieri, I'm the director at the Western New York Nonprofit Support Group, which is a new working group. And we just did a study on the nonprofit sector looking at their strengths and needs through community engagement across the 8 counties of Western New York and Monroe. And so looking at this, I think it was just really interesting to see the alignment and some of, again, the strengths and the weaknesses of the sector, and gets my wheels turning about what we may do about it.
Sam Magavern, Policy Fellow here at PPG, and helped work on the report, and I'll get to talking a little bit about some of the implications of the findings.
Rusty Weaver with Cornell ILR Buffalo here. I am a number cruncher.
So I think, Rusty, you're going to start us off.
Sure. So, like Kristin was saying about data availability, one of the challenges in looking at the social sector from this perspective of being the combination of both the public sector and the nonprofit sector is that measuring that becomes very difficult, because there are a number of data sets that look at the size of government at various spatial scales over time. There are a handful of data sets that give us information on nonprofits, but they tend not to talk to one another. And so one of the challenges that we faced in doing this study was trying to make those data sets talk to one another without seeking a huge external grant to go collect primary data and interview folks in nonprofits locally. And so some of the data sources that exist for your organizations, if you're so interested, that look at the public sector and nonprofit sector along with the private sector, exist from federal data sources. So administrative data sources collected by the US government and put out by a variety of agencies. The 2 most prominent agencies that are involved in this type of work and data collection are the Bureau of Labor Statistics and the US Census Bureau. The Bureau of Labor Statistics puts out a quarterly report on earnings across the economy, and they do divide out and pigeonhole out the public sector. So it's pretty easy to get a sense for the number of public sector establishments in a location, the wages that they pay, and the number of employees. Now, that data set more recently, starting in 2015, also puts out a supplement that engages with IRS data to try to estimate those same figures for a metropolitan region or a state for the nonprofit sector. That's an inexact science because it requires a lot of matching, trying to go in and dig in 990 filings and figuring out who's represented in the larger BLS data set. And so it's inexact, but it's a decent estimate for what we're trying to do in measuring the size of a region's nonprofit sector. Now, one of the potential issues with those data sets is that they're published at what we would call coarse resolutions, geographic resolutions. You could obtain that data from counties, metropolitan areas, or states. And while Buffalo Niagara is a metropolitan region, all we get is an aggregate sense. We don't have any idea of who's working in this sector, what's their educational requirements are, or anything like that. So when we want to try to put a more human face on this workforce, we have to look at some other data sets. The Census Bureau does give us a data set that allows us to put some human characteristics to the workforce. The Local Employment Household Dynamics Survey asks people, it's a survey really of employers, that asks about employees' race and ethnicity, their age, their earnings, how much they're paid. And so trying to put that information together with the Bureau of Labor Statistics data allows us to paint a fuller picture of what the social sector workforce might look like in any region. And of course, we're here in Buffalo Niagara, so that's where we're focused. So if you are interested in these data sets, I don't have time to get into all of the trade-offs, but there are a lot of trade-offs in using these two data sets. And so in the appendix, you'll find a table that looks something like this, that just tries to break down for you what spatial scale you can get these data at, for what time period, what variables are there if you're interested in the social sector, and what challenges you'll face. So you can use that as kind of a quick and dirty worksheet if you want to engage with some of this data on your own. But for our findings, so overall that Bureau of Labor Statistics data set, the most current version of that available is for 2017, and so that gives us an indication of the size of the combined social sector, looking at the public and nonprofit sector together. And what that shows us is that in terms of the number of establishments that fit this sectoral description, it's about 10% of all establishments in Buffalo Niagara, but it employs nearly 30% of the workers. So there's a disproportionate representation there of the social sector in the workforce. Now, of course, that's because a number of institutions in the social sector are very large employers. I think maybe Sam will say more about that in a bit. Places like SUNY Buffalo or Kaleida Health or anything like that. And so that's why you see that huge gap there between the fraction of establishments versus the fraction of employees. Where there's another more subtle and potentially more interesting disproportionality is that even though the social sector accounts for a slightly less than 30% of employees, it accounts for almost 32% of wages, meaning that there's a slight premium in the social sector as a whole. And so what we became interested in was trying to unpack that, because that's not going to be the case for both sides of the social sector as we've defined it. So that premium is largely associated with government jobs, with the public sector. The wage ratio, so average wages per employee in the nonprofit sector to the private sector, is 86%. So nonprofit workers are not represented in that sort of disproportionality between employees and wages. Nonprofit workers do tend to earn less based on what we found. So some of the questions that we asked, the big overarching question was, who works in the social sector? And so this is where we brought in that Census Bureau data set. We had to do some statistical analysis on this and rely on some methods, because this information isn't directly provided by that data set. So there's a description of that in there. I'd be happy to chat with you offline if you're interested in doing something similar. But the results of those analyses were interesting to us to put a face on what the social sector looks like in Buffalo Niagara. So these charts are available for you in the report. I don't have an exact page number to cite, I apologize, but if you go through until you find charts like this, what we found is that the social sector as a whole is much more diverse than the overall economy in Buffalo Niagara, especially in the private nonprofit sector. When looking at the race variable captured by the Census Bureau, whereas the entire workforce in Buffalo Niagara, at least again according to this data set from the Census Bureau, 12.6% of individuals in the workforce were persons of color. In the private nonprofit sector, we estimated that to be about 38%, so a pretty wide gap there. And when you count in governments, the disparity is about 23% of the social sector are persons of color versus 12% in the economy as a whole. So the social sector is, at least in terms of our estimates, more diverse than the overall economy or the private sector. The same thing was found when we looked at ethnicity. Now here's the weird thing about these data sets. So the Census Bureau treats race and ethnicity as separate. This is just an artifact of those data sets. So ethnicity is capturing whether or not someone is reported as being Hispanic or Latinx. And so we found almost the exact same finding across the board on that particular variable, that the social sector, particularly the nonprofit side, was much more diverse in ethnicity relative to the whole economy. Looking at that age attribute that's included in that census data set, the nonprofit workforce we estimated to be pretty young. About a third of nonprofit workers were in the lowest age category, the youngest age category captured by this data set, 29 years or younger. The social sector as a whole, though, is a little bit older than the rest of the economy and the private sector. And that's largely because of, again, the public sector driving that. In terms of education levels, the most diversity that we found was in the nonprofit sector. The nonprofit sector appears to be a sector where workers with lower educational attainment are able to find opportunities. That out of all of the categories, the sectoral categories that we broke out in this report, the nonprofit sector had the largest fraction of individuals without a high school diploma, 13.9% relative to 9.7% of the workforce overall. At the same time, that nonprofit sector, a little over 39% of the workers had a college degree or higher, which was the highest observation in any category there. So there's a lot of diversity in educational attainment in the nonprofit sector. When you aggregate that with the public sector, things are a bit more representative of the overall economy. And then lastly, in terms of wages, these wage categories are the categories put in place by the Census Bureau. So they're kind of weird and arbitrary. It looks at jobs that earn between $0 and $1,250 per month, between $1,251 per month and $3,332 per month, and then $3,333 per month or more. So we didn't establish those categories. They come from the data set. But that $3,333 per month or more is the highest earning category. And when we look across the board at the different sectors of the economy, more social sector workers fall into that category than private sector workers or the economy overall. And when you look at the breakdown of that, though, that's largely because of the public sector. In the nonprofit sector, the plurality of earners are earning $1,250 per month or less. And so we see this wide gulf or disparity or gap in earnings in the overall social sector when we look at it as both the private nonprofit sector and the public sector. And so the last slide that I'll put up here, I didn't finish in time to include in the report, but there's always opportunity for future studies. And so I just wanted to map the geography of the social sector as it came out of our study. One of the advantages of this Census Bureau data set that I've been referring to is that it provides data at a very, very fine spatial resolution so that you can look across a region and see trends across that region. And so this is kind of washed out because apparently I'm not as good of a cartographer as I thought I was. Right? But we can see that the social sector has a footprint throughout the two-county Buffalo-Niagara region. And where you see the darkest shades, if you can see shades at all from where you're seated, those tend to be clustered around large institutions. The SUNY Buffalo is represented there, Buffalo State's College. They exist in, these units are census tracts. It's a federal administrative unit. It's not a neighborhood or anything special. It's just a data collection unit. But the census tracts where those larger institutions fit, these darker shades are representing fractions of all jobs located at that site. And so there are some census tracts that have 90% or more of jobs there in the social sector, and that's because the tracts are drawn around college campuses, basically. So those are more or less what we found in the data, and I'd be happy to answer any questions after the fact. I don't want to interrupt anyone's time, but Kristin will moderate. And so if you have any questions, just feel free to let me know, and I'm happy to talk about any of these methods, data sets, mapping, offline, if you have specific questions about those.
Great, thank you, Rusty. And I think we're kicking it to Sam to share some additional implications.
Great, thank you. I just want to start by saying how great it is to have Kristin and Rusty on the team here. The skills and capacities they bring in-house are just wonderful to have, so great to work with them on this. So here you have a sector of the economy with 1/3 of the workers, 8 out of 10 of the largest employers in the region, and it's a sector that's focused on public goods, not private profit. An additional finding from the study is that it's particularly resistant to automation. much more so than the private sector, which means that along with some other factors, we can expect it to grow more as a percent of the local economy. So it's really big and it's getting bigger. And then, as Rusty said, we found that it's more inclusive than the private sector. The nonprofit sector is twice as racially diverse as the for-profit sector. The nonprofit sector in particular has more jobs for people with less education and experience. Another finding that we haven't mentioned yet, though, is that particularly for nonprofit workers, the pay is substandard. On the government side, as Rusty said, you have higher than average pay. Remember that no one in the government sector is getting rich. You know, none of those jobs are paying enough to make someone affluent. So we're talking about a very big middle class part of the sector in the public sector. On the nonprofit side, it's more bifurcated. So you have a kind of small cluster of quite well-paid employees who are mostly doctors, top university administrators, CEOs of big nonprofits, not a lot of other folks. And then you have a big core at the bottom who have lower than average pay. And then a final finding is that the nonprofit and the government sectors both seem to lag behind when it comes to using technology and data, at least as reflected in the job postings that we analyzed. So put this all together and think about what does it mean for public policy. One of the things that really stood out for us is that it should really change the way we think about economic development. So economic development, the way it's practiced in New York State and really throughout the United States, is using public resources, giving them to the private sector in the hopes of incentivizing job creation or retention. Think about the fight for the Amazon headquarters. So there you had different cities and regions competing with one another for who could offer the most public money to one of the biggest, most profitable private companies in the world. A zero-sum game from the public's point of view because they were going to go someplace, so it's just a question of who gets them. And a huge amount of public resources going to a company with very little discussion of is that company's overall impact good or bad for society. You didn't really read a lot of articles doing a careful analysis of are we promoting the public good with this public money. That's kind of how we do economic development in this country and certainly in this state, in this region. What if we took the findings of this study and said, okay, here we have a huge part of our economy that's devoted to the public good. Wouldn't it make more sense to devote more of our public resources to further developing that part of the economy? And what might that look like? Well, so two key findings that we have this more inclusive part of the economy. So that's something very good to build on. It's already more diverse when it comes to women and people of color in particular. But we also found that it's bifurcated on the nonprofit side, and that many of the jobs are quite low paying and have poor benefits. So what if we invested in making those jobs in particular better jobs, and then also in ensuring that people in those jobs have better career pipelines, so that they're transitioning to higher jobs and not being stuck at the bottom of the nonprofit. So that those investments would not only be redirected from private profit to the public good, but they would also promote various kinds of equity, racial, gender, and other types of equity. The other thing that would kind of leap out is if there is this technology and data gap, maybe that's where we should be investing some of those public resources to build up this part of the sector. And you put all that together and then you look at who's on this panel and who we're going to hear from, and you can see exactly the kind of investments that would make sense. Whether it's something like the Buffalo Commons, that's shared infrastructure for the social sector, whether it's leadership development programs that are making sure that young people, particularly people of color and women, are getting access to the better jobs, whether it's the kind of work that Katie's doing in the shared infrastructure for the nonprofit community. those are all great examples. The other ones that sort of come to my mind are more investments in capital and infrastructure in terms of buildings where nonprofits and government agencies maybe also can co-locate and share resources, whether that's technology or other kinds of resources. So those kinds of hubs and incubators, which some of the folks here are helping to develop, but that seems, when you look at these findings, like a very promising kind of economic development that we could be working on. So I'll leave it at that and turn it over to our other panel members.
Great. And I think we asked Katie to share a little bit about the capacity building needs of nonprofits in Western New York. And just to note that this was a survey of the 8 counties, so just to distinguish it from the Buffalo-Niagara region. So if Katie, you wanted to share.
Sure. Yeah, it's actually 9 because we're
9,
in Monroe.
okay.
Yeah, so it's the 8 counties of Western New York and Monroe County because of the funders groups. So the Western New York Nonprofit Support Group is, as I said, a new working group that I just came on about 3 months ago, first staff member that was brought in. And the group really seeks to strengthen communities across the 8 counties of Western New York and Monroe by really increasing the capacity of the nonprofit organizations that serve those regions. And what we're really looking to do is build on the existing resources that already exist in our community, and then attempting to fill any gaps that have been identified by nonprofits. So the current makeup of the group is the Western New York Foundation, the Ralph C. Wilson Jr. Foundation, the John R. Oishei Foundation, the Health Foundation of Western and Central New York, and the Peter and Elizabeth Tower Foundation, in addition to 2 independent consultants that have been working in the capacity building space for decades, really. And so the group engaged the Center for Governmental Research out of Rochester and the Community Health Worker Network of Buffalo to do community engagement and asset mapping with nonprofits across the region. And the approach that they took to data collection for that was kind of fourfold. They looked at best practice research across the country. They also did an organizational survey by email. So they didn't look at universities and hospitals and some of those larger groups, and they also didn't look at nonprofits with budgets under $25,000. So we got it down to about 853 from over 13,000 nonprofits across this 9-county region that we sent the survey to. We got about a 20% response rate from that. And then to add some more depth to that kind of information, they also did 30 interviews with nonprofit leaders, really making sure that they took an approach that looked at diversity when it comes to the life cycle of the organization, the location of the organization, and the size of the organization. And then they also did 7 focus groups across the region with about 129 participants across the region as well. And then with that, they came up with this interactive asset map because there was 3 guiding principles for the study. The first really was taking a diversity, equity, and inclusion lens to the work. The nonprofit support group really felt like one of the things that was driving this study was to really understand the more marginalized groups that don't typically have access to philanthropy. Why aren't they accessing it? What are some of those barriers? So that part of our strategy will be like how to break some of that down. And we looked at marginalized groups as small grassroots nonprofits, nonprofits led by people of color, and the rural organizations that typically haven't accessed it, so not necessarily Buffalo-Niagara as much as some of the other rural counties that we looked at. And then I will say that while it is the full 9-county region, Erie County, it did represent like a large number of the organizations that responded, and 2 of the focus groups were in Buffalo and 2 were in Niagara, so I do think the data is a little tilted toward Buffalo-Niagara. And then, so in addition to the diversity, equity, inclusion lens, we also took a strength-based approach, so really making sure that we led with assets, which was a little bit more difficult, according to the researchers, than they thought it was going to be. I think sitting down with nonprofits and saying, 5 funders want to hear what you need was really hard for them to say, like, well, this is what we do really well. But we really, they pushed through it because it there is a lot of strength, and I think your data shows that. Like, there is a lot of strength in the sector, and we feel like it's something that should be celebrated. And so often, especially coming from a foundation perspective, we're looking at what needs to be fixed. And so I think it's important that we're also celebrating the strengths. And lastly, really taking an iterative approach to the work. So making sure that the nonprofit voice was brought in, not just during the interviews in the focus groups, but through the process. So they help design what the focus groups look like, what the survey looked like, and things like that. And I would say that those guiding principles are things that I'm bringing into the work moving forward. So as we start doing strategy development, I'm also making sure that we have a diversity, equity, inclusion lens, strength-based, and making sure that there is nonprofit voice brought in and that we're willing to make changes as changes need to be made. So there was, as you can imagine, a lot of data that was collected through all of that. So I won't go through all of the things that were discussed. The report is available on our website, as is the interactive asset-based map. It's wnynsg.org. But there was two really overarching themes that I would say were brought up almost in every single, the survey, the focus group, and the interviews. And the first was that respondents really felt that something the nonprofit sector does extremely well is alignment and collaboration. They really brought to the attention of the researchers a lot of the coalitions and networks that currently exist. But one thing that they felt was really lacking is diversity across that. So outside, like they're typically sector siloed by the sector that they work in. So groups that all work on health all meet and talk to one another, but not necessarily with arts and things like that. In addition to that, they also identified a real need for cross-geographic across our 9-county region. You know, you often hear us talk about the 8 counties of Western New York, but I would venture to say that a lot of those in Erie County wouldn't be able to tell you 10 nonprofits in Cattaraugus, right? So I think really trying to build some more of those bridges is important. And then also size. So one thing that came out of the focus groups that I think is promising is that some of the larger nonprofits leaders left the focus group saying, you know, I was a little nervous about the future of the sector is going to look like, and then I met some of the smaller grassroots nonprofit leaders, and I have a lot of hope. But I think like creating those spaces for more of that interaction and more of you know, being able to share knowledge and share learning across sector, geographic region, and size is a really important thing. And so that's something that some of our like initial strategies are thinking about, but I'm going to be going out to talk to nonprofits about what our initial strategies look like. We're not going to make any decisions without their input, and so really making sure that that's something that they do want to see, and then how they would like to see that happen. And then the other overarching theme, which probably isn't going to be a surprise to anyone, is funding. So it was talked about often. And I think more specifically, something that nonprofits really identified as a barrier to being able to build their own capacity and organizational capacities is that programmatic project-based funding that you see so often from both philanthropic sources but also government sources. And so is there ways that we can change that a bit? And so as a group of mostly funders, what we have decided is that we are going to be in dialogue with nonprofits and really start creating more space for nonprofits and foundations to have more transparent discussion about how funding decisions are made and things like that, you know, kind of get rid of the man behind the curtain that is so prevalent in philanthropy. But also internally having discussions amongst ourselves. Like nonprofits really identified that they want safe spaces where they can interact and talk to one another, not necessarily funder driven or funder watched. And so I think, you know, allowing that same space for foundations is going to be really important too. So not just with the 5 of us, but is there ways that we can open up that discussion with foundations across our region to talk about how we may be able to do things a little bit differently so that access looks different. And there's plenty more. So as I said, there at your seats there is kind of a quick overview And the chart that's in there are opportunities that nonprofits identified as things that we could potentially do, or things that the sector would like to see. But again, this is ideas from them. It's not necessarily, me as one staff person is definitely not doing everything on that list. But we're really looking forward to starting to do the community conversations across the region to hear more from nonprofits about what they would like to see us be.
Great. Thank you, Katie. And I think Franchelle's going to share a little bit more, and I just wanted to give a little shout out. Orlando just attended one of the most recent programs that Open Buffalo hosted, and they had over 100 different types of leaders. And as someone who worked in a lot of leadership development preparation, defining leaders in a lot of different ways in your community, whether that means working in nonprofits, on boards of nonprofits, working in government, figuring out what as a community member you can do as a worker, I think that is hugely important. So I just wanted to give her some props, and then also ask her to share a little bit more about that model and what that looks like and what that means here in Western New York.
Awesome, thank you. We actually just got the footage from JLI this morning, and there's a feature of Orlando in it, and your analysis on the necessity of creating cross-sector spaces for people to learn was featured in the video, so I can share that with individuals that are interested.
Yeah.
But I do want to talk about 3 unique strategies that Open Buffalo uses. First, the diversity and equity lens in all of the work that we're doing, right? Generally, if we're doing economic development in a way where everyone can't benefit, what's the point, right? So in order to actualize that, we utilize leadership development, collaboration with government, and as Sam spoke of earlier, non-for-profits and central hub locations. The leadership development piece of what we do, we run a multi-tiered leadership development program. The most recent initiative is what we were just speaking of, the Justice Leadership Institute. And we really see that as an entry point into non-for-profit work and community organizing. The JLI provides a broad-based community organizing, advocacy, and public narrative training for up to 100 individuals in the year. From there, if we look at the leadership development journey that one can embark on, they can enter into the Emerging Leaders Program. The Emerging Leaders Program, now we've graduated 100 graduates from the program, and leaders here. We graduated 100 leaders from the program, and they are doing incredibly awesome things in the not just in Buffalo or New York State, but across the nation, from working inside and outside of government institutions to leading non-for-profit and advocacy organizations from around the country. So some of the theory behind that is folks already have the necessary skills, capacities, and passions, right? So what are the additional wraparound services that we can provide in order to take individuals that are looking to enter back into the workforce to the next level? Some of those are simple offering of childcare in order to participate in a program. We match all of the participants in the Emerging Leaders and the Democracy Fellows program with community-based mentors. We have a lot of our mentors here in the room. But the mentor piece has really become a central part in the work that we're doing. Having that one-on-one coaching with individuals and also exposing them to networks. We've heard time and time again that the major barrier for marginalized people in our community is entering into the old boys network, right? How do you do that, right? How do you get the job interview when you don't know the CEO, right? Your uncle doesn't work for a particular company, right? And so our overall goal for the mentorship program is not only that one-on-one coaching, but taking this into your mentee and really exposing them to your network, right? And ensuring that they're gaining the skills and capacities throughout the program, but those meaningful relationships and those deep connections that are necessary for individual and professional growth. Our Democracy Fellows program. The Democracy Fellows program is a year-long intensive program where, again, we match them with a mentor, but then also a coach in the industry. For example, Michael Zach, he is the co-creator of Grow Up, and it's an aquaponics worker cooperative. And he spent his fellowship really constructing a curriculum on how young people of color can get into the aquaponics industry, right? And we all know that that's a secret because I have absolutely no idea what he does. I just see tanks and pipes and a lot of stuff, and I'm like, oh, that looks really cool. But taking the data that we talked about here and curriculum and really breaking it down to a grassroots level, right? And so much of the work that Open Buffalo does is taking spaces like this, taking the work that Mike Zach is doing and making it accessible for folks looking to enter into the industry. Also, the Open Buffalo Fellow Program, again, is a one-on-one coaching program. We bring people, again, that are looking for additional workforce development opportunities and mentor them in the office. So day to day, the ins and outs, the part of administering non-for-profit organizations that don't necessarily get into missions and strategic plans, right? So what are all of the behind the scenes pieces that are necessary to run an organization and coalitions? So Open Buffalo Fellows have those opportunities to get those hands-on experiences as well. A lot of our advocacy that wraps around our leadership development programs, where I just heard a rather disturbing statistic that now is actually a growing number of people of color that are graduating Buffalo Public Schools that can't pass the 10th grade math assessment for the Northland Corridor. So we're seeing, again, all of the investments. I think for so long we've all been saying, well, where's the investment on the east side of Buffalo? Where's the investment for people of color and working class people? We have it, and we still lack the skills and capacities in order to be able to benefit, right? So one, our job is to make sure that folks know what is happening in our communities, but then also be a connector, right? There are resources and skills and other programs. We have an awesome opportunity sitting right here, right? So how are we making sure that we're connecting all of the dots in our community to make sure especially our young people have a fighting chance in the development that's coming to our community. Also looking at the Emerging Leaders Program as a workforce development placing organization. And our theory there is start small and go to scale, right? So we found that after a survey, 67% of our community allies and partners have hired emerging leaders, right? So how do we use that as a microcosm and how we go to scale? How do we ensure that where the engagement with the Emerging Leaders Program doesn't just stop at graduation, and then again that we're able to grow and amplify the workforce development opportunities through the Emerging Leaders Program. The second strategy is government collaboration, and looking at that as not only a sustainability model for non-for-profits, but also like how are we doing economic revitalization in a way that really impacts people in the community. We have two examples of how that collaboration has panned out. The first is looking at police accountability and police transparency. Typically for non-for-profit and social sector organizations, social justice organizations, the leaning is we're organizing against the police, right? But how can we take the frustration and the real occurrences that are happening in the community and really build a bridge for relationship buildings and public policy? And in partnership with our Partnership for the Public Good and numerous other community allies, we were able to engage over 2,500 people throughout, really expanded outside of the city of Buffalo, but really figure out like what's happening on the ground. How can we build trust and collaboration with Buffalo PD and local law enforcement? And what grew out of that, out of 32 recommendations, 11 of those recommendations have been implemented by Buffalo PD thus far, including them implementing accreditation at Buffalo PD as well. But we were able to develop a police accountability council, citizen-driven. We have 2 emerging leaders on that council, right? So how do we look at that and say, okay, so now what is our need here, right? The budget for Buffalo Police is increasing, as we see. So how do we use the community organizing and the advocacy skills that we've learned through emerging leaders to say, okay, so we also want community officers in this. And we learned about a potential new opportunity in the Boys and Men of Color meeting on a violence prevention officer, right? And so, like, how do we look to best practices from around the nation and use government relationships to implement those things? Also, the third economic strategy, again, as Sam said, using non-for-profit collaboration and co-location as an economic driver. Right now, we're collaborating with New York Immigration Coalition and the Fruit Belt Land Trust to really ensure that every possible dime that can come into the Jefferson neighborhood, that the residents and the community-based organizations in those neighborhoods receive every penny that it deserves. So again, using government collaboration and community engagement and learned leadership development skills to drive economic opportunity on the grassroots level. So that's what Open Buffalo's up to.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Franchelle. And I like how you said, and there's a 3-book volume on investing in America's workforce, and one of the first things they say is that investing starts at the K-12, even at the pre-K level, because that's where the ideas come from, the skills, whether or not students feel equipped with them, what types of people they interact with, how they're supported throughout that trajectory. So I love that you mentioned that. And we asked Tommy to come here, and as he mentioned, he heads the Boys and Young Men of Color here in Buffalo. And I know I don't look like someone who works with boys and young men of color, obviously, but in New Mexico, we did a lot with our young men there in their drum group. So for a lot of our indigenous communities, there's different roles different folks can play in trying to help both increase graduation rates, but also just support community in ways that boys can work within our Native communities there. And then at some of the other schools that we worked with, we worked a lot with the Boys and Young Men of Color initiatives there. So we asked Tommy to share a little bit more about that and a little bit more about some of the opportunities and some of the potential challenges in the work that he does.
Well, just very quick, just give you a quick kind of background on how it all came to be, and going back to approximately almost 6 years ago now, where I guess the Community Foundation convened some folks in this area, about 40 nonprofits and also public sector, governmental sector. They all basically got at a table and decided to look at Buffalo through a racial equity lens. And in doing so, out of that, they came up with basically 9 recommendations. Out of that 9 recommendations, one of it was Boys and Men of Color Initiative. And the reason why that came about is because that initiative was one in which nationwide, you look at the numbers, the needle is moving. For that group of young men, the needle is just not moving as fast as it's moving for other folks. And so from that is how it developed. I ended up working at Say Yes, and it was a kind of a strategic move there also, actually to take the Boys and Men of Color work and drop it into a kind of a machine that was already moving, that had captured a large number of the young people in this community. So right just off the bat, Buffalo Public Schools and charter schools, you're talking about anywhere from 30 to 40,000 young people. So you're actually falling in a place where the machines, and so that created some of the partnerships that, as you were talking about partnerships before, partnerships that I didn't have to create, they were already created, and just attaching to those partnerships. And then from that, we actually started out, and when we started the initiative, the first thing out of the box was we as adults said we knew the answers, and then about 15 minutes into it, we realized we didn't know the answer. All right, and so what we decided to do was actually to convene young people and adults. So we had a young people adult partnership. We met at Bennett High School on a Saturday morning from 9 to 12 for about 4 months. And these young people actually came on their own, and the whole key was to make sure we had youth voice in the front end. And I think so often, I just left a meeting this morning, and they were talking about strategies and stakeholders and all these, and I just raised my hand and says, well, you're talking about education, and stakeholders are young people. They're not at the table. How do we get them at the table? So part of this initiative is how do we get young people at the table actually to be a part of the decision-making process. And so just kind of going fast forward as we pulled together, it's we developed the breaking barriers. And then when you see breaking barriers and you see all the colors and all the stuff, all the flyers and stuff, we didn't do that. That was young people. We asked so young people to come up with a name, and they did their focus groups, and they went through all the colors. We want to use this color. We don't want to use that color. But it was one of the things I kind of referenced. It doesn't really may not fit here, but I just want you to grab is that those young people were intelligent enough smart enough to look at even the colors and say, wait a minute, the Obama Foundation is using these colors. Let's do that so we can connect. And so what we found is that they want to have basic connection in the process. And so we began doing that, and we pulled together, and the first things we were really interested in was youth voice, making sure we highlighted youth voice. The other thing was beginning to change the narrative for young men of color, which impacts the job market, which impacts so many other areas. And so in that process of changing the narrative, it's not to change the narrative of what society thinks of the young men. It's to change the narrative of what they think of themselves. And if they think of themselves different, then when we start talking about employment, we start talking about becoming entrepreneurs, they see themselves different, so they can do that. So they become so often they're on the other side of the movers and shakers. How do we make them part of the movers and shakers and also give them a community mindset? So that was the goal of that. And so from that point on, the other main goal was that they would have to deal with policy issues. And so they actually have policy issues every year. They have to put together a policy agenda. The policy agenda this year, they looked at things that were impacting young men of color. The first thing was suspensions, and suspensions, as we know, is a national issue. And so by just raising suspension as their policy issue, suspension has become very, I know I'm being recorded, so let me say it the right way. It's been highlighted amongst Buffalo Public Schools because, and these young men had a voice in that. In addition to that, they also understood that they said they start sitting around and realized, and this was a true conversation we were talking about, I think Orlando, you may have been there, when they were talking about having teachers that look like themselves. And they went around and realized that none of them had teachers that looked like themselves. And so they said, okay, educator diversity was one of their next policy, looking at Buffalo Public Schools and some of our charter schools and say, okay, there should be teachers that look like me also. And this all leads into the economics that where the social sector we're talking about here. And then from that point on, the last one they had was kind of advanced placement. They realized that in order to make it into the various markets, they have to take AP courses. And they realized that most AP courses, they didn't have the AP course discussion into their senior year. And it says by then it was basically too late. And so now we're looking at how do we make sure that not just freshmen, how do we make sure 6th graders and 7th graders are talking about AP courses that they'll be taking in senior year and setting themselves up for that. Got a lot here, but a long story short, I remember sitting and young people being able to culturally present the information in a way they could understand it. They understood AP courses because we started talking about the cost of college tuition. and what an AP course does to college tuition. And one young man said, oh, okay, so if I get more AP courses, I don't have to pay as much tuition, I won't have as much loans, my credit score will be higher, I can get my house sooner. All right. When we start talking like that, then they understand the importance of AP courses, and now these young men are willing to go back and start talking to sixth graders about it. And so that's the kind of thing is that this whole thing it's going to have it's socially minded, but also has to have a bottom line which impacts dollars in our community and how it actually flows over to these young people. One other thing I just wanted to kind of raise, once we actually came together with these young people, their ages 12 to 24, but we look at cradle to career. 12 to 24 is just a little breaking barriers piece we do, but what they do is we look at young people from cradle, and they say cradle to career. I like to say we have to go beyond cradle, because if the mother has high lead levels, that child's going to have problems in third grade. And so how do we look at all the way from the time that child is conceived to they end up in the workforce, and looking at every milestone in between there to make sure that they can enter the workforce and even make the decision between, do I want to go in the private sector or public sector? And understanding what private sector and public sector means. And if they want to go in the private sector, that they will go in the private sector with a community mindset. Understanding that even if I do make big dollars, I have a responsibility of big dollars rolling back into the community that I love. So that is what we kind of filter in the leadership piece. We meet every other week. We meet, and then we actually graduate out. And the last thing I'm going to say is with the graduation piece is, they also have a responsibility to their brothers. And so at graduation, one of the responsibilities is they have to find another young man who needs the same thing that they have. Go back, find that young man in their community, bring them in, make sure they fill the application out, register, and then they have to come back for another year and be a peer mentor for that young man to make sure he's successful. And so what we're doing is building a cadre of young people who are able to begin changing the surface and the platform of the community we work in. And then the bottom line, we put them on boards, and they're on the mayor's commission, and they sit on boards at other organizations. They will sit on there. This morning was arguing. They'll be sitting on the policy committee this morning, and we're going to have 2 slots we got this morning. And so what we do is we actually put them in places of influence, where they can begin changing things and can begin to elevate youth voice. I think that's enough for now.
That's amazing. Thank you, Tommy. And just to highlight 2 of the things that you had mentioned, number 1, just what it takes even for someone to apply for a job. So again, when we were looking at the data, people who do have jobs, don't have jobs, what they make, what level, but there's all these things that go before and after. Once you're in a work environment, what is your experience there? And how do you deal with that? And how do you interact with your coworkers who might not have the mindsets that you have? And then I liked how you mentioned infiltrating maybe some of those private for-profit things, so that you are community-minded and you do give back. So I like that too.
Yeah, I think so often we talk about a young person who's the first in their family to go to college, but there's also young people who are first in their family to hold down a full-time job. And so when we were talking about some of this, it's so foreign, is that there has to be folks who actually walk them through that process, so they can actually, when they get to the door, they're not afraid of going into the door. And so that's kind of what we're doing here. And that's not just the private sector, but even also in your nonprofits. A lot of your nonprofits are shutting doors also. And so how do we make sure that our young people are set and prepared to actually to go through some of those doors also?
And then last but certainly not least, we asked Curtis to join us. As a confession, Curtis and I sat down one time in our first meeting, and we just wonked out on strategy and evaluation and measurement and data. So it was one of the things that I know Oishei and a lot of other foundations are looking at, is how do you measure and evaluate different strategies, different impacts, I think primarily of nonprofit organizations, but correct me if I'm wrong, and what that means and looks like, both from this vantage point, but also from a community standpoint, because I think that is one of the biggest things that we hear a lot is, well, how is this impacting the community, especially when we think about the social sector as being oriented towards that public interest. So I know you have a lot written there, so I'm excited to hear.
So just like the social sector has an incredible impact on the economy, it also has an incredible impact in philanthropy in general. Just to give you some context, so on an annual basis, we're looking at about $160 million from the 30-plus foundations just locally here in Western New York. And initially, you think about that, and on average, you would say about $25,000 per grant. So we're looking at about 6,000 grants that are put out into the community each year. And that's an incredible burden. And a lot of nonprofits, you would assume, oh yeah, I got an award. That's fantastic. But there's a lot of work that goes into writing that grant and then receiving that award, but then the work begins after they receive that money. And a lot of times it's the capacity of the organization to be able to utilize that. And evaluation is an additional component that's built on top of it, which in the past, it always was a burden, and it continues to be a burden for a lot of the nonprofits reporting to the federal government, where they have to actually report on empirical data and go through a very rigorous process. So locally, thankfully over the last 10 years, it's been my career, I've seen it evolve considerably. When I first came on board, there were some times where we would administer a grant, and believe it or not, the majority of those dollars would go towards evaluation, a very small percentage to the actual program. And we thought to ourselves, we have to do better at this because it's not positioning that nonprofit well. At the same time, how do we build the capacity of that organization? So we become much more than just a funder. We pride ourselves in offering philanthropic support, leadership development opportunities. There's also capacity building opportunities in the community through a lot of the research that we provide. One example, I don't know how familiar you are with the Mobile Safety Net team, but they are throughout Western New York, and I'm happy to say that they're releasing an update to their community reports, and they have a vast number of coalitions. It currently stands at 12 coalitions, and what's nice about that is they're able to utilize that data and determine an agenda that they co-create, and then they're able to execute on that agenda and bring in multiple partners. Because I think that's the other important aspect of this, is that we're not talking about strictly nonprofits. If we're going to succeed in accomplishing a lot of our missions and battling some of these important community issues, we have to also involve the private sector as well as government. So we've seen a considerable shift in evaluation, and now it's moving towards more of an opportunity for shared learning. But also it opens the door to authentic partnerships. And we recognize that we do not have all the answers. And it's up to us to be able to listen to the community and determine what's the right course of action. And we've changed that considerably over the last 5 years. And it's interesting because there's a book that I just recently read. It's called Mission Impact. The author's Robert Sheehan. And he talks about, he makes a great example that for many of these nonprofits, the burdens are real, and the faster you move in the wrong direction, the further you are away from where you need to be. And what he's really saying there is a lot of times philanthropy can do the most by kind of just stepping out of the way. And there's an opportunity for us to actually co-create the strategies, the metrics that were used for measurement, because why should we reinvent the wheel? And that better positions the nonprofit to be successful. So that's kind of where we're at. We've resized our overall grant making process for smaller organizations. And to give you an idea, 50% of our grant dollars go to smaller organizations. They're typically $25,000 or less. And for those organizations, they're typically led by 1 or 2 individuals. They certainly do not have the capacity to file rigorous reports, provide expenditures, and so on and so forth. So what we're trying to do is collaborate with some of the other local funders and determine a process that alleviates some of those challenges. So I'll leave it at that.
Great, thank you, Curtis. Now, I know we're going to shift a little bit from this agenda, just because I realize we are running out of time, and I want to give the opportunity for any of the folks here who joined us to ask questions. I do have a few here, but I wanted to open it up first to see if anyone had any questions for any of our panelists. Yeah?
I have a question. I wanted to ask you about expanding the
He's a plant in the audience. All right. The Boys and Men of Color Initiative actually doing that work, and we realized that we're reaching such a small piece of Buffalo. You know, it's 100 young men, but it's still such a small piece when we look at the number we're talking about. So we're actually working with, in our alignment with the city and also BPS, of actually introducing this as a course elective for every young man who actually comes in, and it will have also the social justice kind of lean to it. And so their first year they can elect to take this course and get a credit for it. And the only problem we're running into is that to make sure that it's the right person teaching the course. All right, because we have a lot of things to deal with when you get into BPS on who teaches the course, and so we have to how to figure that out. But the bottom line is, not only do we're embedding it into the school system, but we're also looking at, okay, we're going to do the same thing on the west side, because the issues on the lower west side, a young man on the lower west side is not the same issues as a young man on the east side of Buffalo, or you're talking about a young man in Black Rock. And so we're actually taking and tweaking the curriculum for the young people that we're dealing with, and looking at the economic impact on those young people. It varies from community to community.
That's awesome. I didn't know that.
I'll tell you everything.
I have a question just to piggyback off that. Is there an age restriction, or what are some of the qualifications for the gentlemen and young men that you're bringing in?
The only restriction is between the age of 12 and 24 in school and out of school.
Okay.
That's it.
Yeah.
Congratulations on a terrific report and assembling such an inspiring panel. I had a question about quality of jobs in the social sector. You talked about wages, but I wonder about other metrics for sort of how good these jobs are, just in terms of what do we know, and then in terms of those of you who are actually operating these organizations, what do you do to make sure that the jobs within these organizations are high quality, and how much of a consideration is that for funders, the quality of jobs within these organizations?
It's a great question. I'll answer that just briefly in terms of the literature of some of the research that we did. So we dug deep into just nonprofit studies. So there's been a lot of studies based out of California, I think based out of Minnesota, who have large numbers of nonprofits. It may be the experience that people have here, but the conditions in a lot of nonprofits specifically tend to be really high demanding, because there's the trade-off that people, again, this is the argument that people make, there's a trade-off because people get to do life-fulfilling work. So they are willing to volunteer more of their time to a really great cause. But it's interesting, and also in a terrible way, the connection as it relates to, as Sam mentioned, the equity issues. So this is primarily, or the majority, both nationwide and here in Buffalo, women. So it's an equity challenge there, and people of color. So even particularly women of color. So if it's people who are working these crazy number of hours, or knowing that they take money out of their own pocket in order to contribute to something, the general literature, and we haven't done a specific study as it related to here in Buffalo, but that's what it says, is that the conditions are actually more strenuous. And so again, this was something we decided to keep out of the report. Anecdotally, and in some of the minor pieces of data that we found, people can and have gone from their experiences in the nonprofit sector, so building those skills, mindsets, capacities, and then having to go to something like the for-profit sector in order to pay for loans, in order to get more regular hours at some points. And so that was one of the interesting findings, that we couldn't have enough of a large data set in order to do a huge study for this particular report. But that is one of the questions that we had for a future one, is this something we see here in Buffalo? What does that mean? What does that look like? Are people moving from this social sector into something like the for-profit sector after people have invested all these skills and resources into those individuals? But I'll pass it down, yeah.
I had two things to add. One was, we mentioned this very briefly in the report, but when comparing the nonprofit to the government part of the social sector, and the government wages being better overall, but also sort of more equitably distributed, one factor that we mentioned is unionization. Classic way to compress and improve wages. So that was definitely striking to us. But the other thing I wanted to mention was some of us were involved in the formation of Open Buffalo. And we had really in-depth discussions about the pay scale when we started a new nonprofit in Buffalo. And one of the explicit goals of founding Open Buffalo was to pay employees above the average for nonprofits in Buffalo, because we thought that the average was artificially and detrimentally low, and that it led to high staff turnover, bad morale, and lots of other problems. And so that that discussion, I think, needs to be ongoing in this region as in others. And a classic example would be the number of community organizers who get hired away from nonprofits to work for unions. It's very predictable almost. And there was an example last month, but it just keeps on happening. Why? Because they have much better pay and benefits. So there's a lesson there.
Yeah. I would add, like in our study, one of the greatest strengths that was mentioned was the get it done mentality of people who work in nonprofit, but then one of the greatest needs was burnout prevention, right? So I think it's something that people are well aware of. And then along the lines of the funding issue and what funders are gonna do about it, like the nonprofits identified the raising of minimum wage to be an issue, right? In which I think from a perspective of just like the principle of it, I think they're totally for it. Like, yes, we should have a livable wage as a minimum wage, but from running a business, it's really difficult to run your business when minimum wage keeps going up and the funding doesn't change, right? Like the average grant's $25,000. We're not, government's not really changing the way they're funding things, and so that is definitely an issue.
Yeah, I'll just add to that. It's year after year, it's one of the biggest challenges that we identify for the nonprofit community. We do an assessment to identify who are the leaders that are changing positions or simply retiring, because as we saw in the report, incredible aging population working in nonprofit, and most of those are also in key leadership roles. So we identify that list and how we can assist those organizations in possibly looking for replacement. But the other issue you have here is that 80+%, I think I saw as the national number, organizations do not have a retention strategy. So in order to attract and retain the youth and to drive the mission of various nonprofits, I think that we do need to pull this out and make it a priority. And the other issue we run into is that I also noticed that about half of those individuals that do leave, they actually stay in the nonprofit sector. So it'd be interesting to know, where are they going? Are they moving away from leadership roles, or are they starting another 501c3, or what does it look like for that group?
I'm curious to know if anybody here is involved in New York State's new investment in workforce development, and if so, how that could be focused on the social sector, or particularly the nonprofit sector. Are people thinking about that? $175 million. I'm interested. I mean, I think we should consider that. We should think about what this body of information and action could propose to the state of New York for this sector in this region.
And I think they have a workshop on it on September 24th
At Northland.
Northland.
No.
Right. So I think we should conspire
in a good way.
in the best of all possible ways to think about how we might provide some opportunities for very innovative investment.
And that's an interesting point related to the data piece too. And I think, as mentioned earlier here too, just where is this revenue coming from? How do nonprofits, being nonprofits, some of them can be membership organizations, or they can charge for their services, but they don't turn over a profit. So there's different levels of what that means and looks like. But oftentimes they're funded by government programs. They could be funded by foundations. They could get their funding elsewhere. And so I think you mentioned, as this funding changes, they still have to provide services. So certain things get cut. And I think Rusty had shared that we have some sort of data, but it's going to take a longer time to dissect it, to say, if you look in the report, there are different types of categories of nonprofits. So it could be animal related, it could be workforce development, different ways that nonprofits categorize themselves. And you can see the changes over time in the Buffalo Niagara area. So some people can look at that as sort of a zero-sum game. Could it be taken from one, and now people are more invested in this type of arts organization, or less invested in this type of community building organization? And so what does that mean in terms of, as funding priorities change both for government entities and for some new foundations that could be coming into areas, what does that mean for nonprofits to partner and build collaborations amongst themselves? But what does that also mean for the way that work gets done, and for something investing in like a retention strategy? And so it's a curious part to see, where does the funding come from, and how has that changed over time? So I don't know if anyone on the panel has any experience with any of that in shifting some of those things.
Not exactly, but
Yeah.
on the fringe is that part of our discussion with the Boys and Men of Color's initiative is that looking at funding, where our funding came from. And so because we were working with other nonprofits, smaller nonprofits in the community that work with young men of color, right away from our discussion with our coalition is that I cannot go look for money locally. Because what it does, it limits the amount of impact for a small nonprofits out there, because if we're competing for the same dollars, therefore then we end up fighting. And so we can't, it also cuts into collaboration. And so basically what I do, all my funding I look for is national funding. And so it's bringing new dollars in, which just by bringing new dollars into a community now, that becomes my ally no more so than my competitor. And just begin, I think we have to start thinking like that.
Oh, exactly, because I don't know whether it's still true, but a few years ago when I did look at the data, Buffalo Niagara brings in pathetically little federal dollars, in this arena. And so I think there is potential capacity for getting more from the federal government.
I would add too, I think like in the health sector, like especially around social determinants of health, there's, Medicaid redesign, and that's ending, and so value-based payment is becoming another whole animal that takes a lot to understand. And but there's a lot of community-based organizations that have been doing this work for a really long time, that have been doing their own fundraising, and how can we build the capacity of those groups to really access this value-based payment money that's going to be out there. I think that's one opportunity that I see for like future change. And I think impact investing, like we have an impact investing organization here now. I think that also has a lot of opportunity for social impact investing if we can build the capacity of nonprofits to really like be able to do their data and evaluation in a way that can show that that investment is worthwhile.
Is workforce development a particular new emphasis coming in from federal and state government funding? That would be
The state sort of reorganized theirs. The federal government, I think, is kind of static, what is coming through the Workforce Investment Board. And we might, in those federal funds, I think we might expect no change in the next year and a half or so in that. But the state's initiative is new, and it's being run through the REDCs, the Regional Economic Development Councils.
Do they have much contact with on-the-ground grassroots not-for-profits? For instance, Northland didn't seem to spend much time when they were setting it up with the notion of where students would come from, who they were, what their capacities were. So that the failure rate, for instance, as I've heard and seen, is about 80% for math and basic reading skills to be trained on the remarkably new manufacturing techniques.
Yeah,
which are quick. So the rates are startlingly high, and I'm not sure anyone except, I know a little program in Catholic Charities, but anyone's actually trying to systematically address how one gets the basic math and math and reading skills up to a certain minimum level. I don't think BPS doesn't seem focused. Colleges and universities, I think this is just really outside of their thinking at the moment. So are we pouring money in it from some kind of funnel, and it's simply not being effective at all? Northwoods is a fantastic facility. I mean, Tommy, you're involved in stuff like that. I mean, what's going on is what are these huge opportunities that the gaps just need to be filled immediately. I don't know.
Yeah. Just from having some conversation with Stephen Tucker over there, is that just even getting to the place where the local nonprofits are actually, I know with Impact Young Men of Color, they don't have the capacity in order to, we're back to a capacity issue, in order to gear up enough in order to be to handle some of those issues now that we're starting to see. And so the question is now, how do we build the capacity of, for me, it became a boys' men of color issue. How do we actually build the capacity of these organizations to get the math scores up? All right, and then also at the same time, I think we also still have to hold BPS accountable in this process. And so how do we do, I think it's not one or two things, it's several things all have to be done at the same time.
Well, I think we have about 7 or so minutes left. So I might launch into one of my wrap-up questions, and that is either there's a lot of information here, right, and there's a lot of implications or potential policy impacts or other types of suggestions and recommendations that we have. So you get to pick your poison. What other recommendations do you think should come out of this, or how do you think the social sector should look in the next couple of years? Whether if your programs do what it is you're trying to do, what is sort of the hopeful trajectory or opportunity or way that we're going? And are we in that trajectory, or what are some of the things that we have to do in order to get there? So if someone wants to kick us off with that really easy question.
Well, I'll go. If everything works out the way that it should, leadership in the city looks completely different, right? All positions of all sectors, elected and not-for-profit leadership, will hold the values that we all talked about here today. It's representative of all communities here. It's not just English speaking. It represents all nationalities and ethnicities, right? But how do we get there? And really kind of taking the micro look, and like what are those things that are happening? How can we ensure that we're providing all of the wraparound services necessary to get people to the next phase? But it's for Open Buffalo, it's really like monitoring where the leadership development opportunities are, and how are we training people to get there. How do we train? Like there's executive director training, but is there deputy director training, right? And like how are we ensuring that that we're also not just the public facing positions, right, but all levels of leadership in this city. finance and administration. Like that's not a sexy sector, right? Everyone's like, I don't want to do that. I'll leave that to someone else, right? But we need people that hold our values at every level of leadership, right? So that is what my brother right here has tons of finance, but it was in years in and out of government, right? But that was honestly that was a rare situation that you have someone with decades of experience that is actually coming back into the not-for-profit sector, right? With numerous skills in accounting and finance, right? So I pray for that, right? But typically, like our non-for-profits, especially social justice and grassroots organizations, don't have access to this type of leadership, right? So we need to ensure that this type of leadership isn't coming from other communities, but that we're growing it, right? We have the bodies here, so we need to set up the networks, the skills, and the capacities to make sure that the people that have ridden the years of disinvestment, that they have a shot at all of the investment that's coming.
I can make mine very short. Is basically everything she said, and actually for me, it was going upstream. It began educating young people and getting to the place where when they're ready to go, they're ready to go. Mm-hmm. All right, and so and getting to the place that when she says I need a finance person, now it's a crop she can choose from. Mm-hmm. So that's for me is that go upstream, and I think some of it we're going to have to create from the inside out.
I have one idea that I forgot to sneak into the report, so I'll say it now, which is a BPS magnet school for public service. So you have government, which we described has those good wages, good benefits, but it's not as diverse and inclusive as the nonprofit sector. And then you have disadvantaged populations that need access to those jobs. So you put those two needs together, and you have a magnet school where the kids get exposed to civil service type jobs, to police, to fire, to especially teaching in public schools, even to finance and administration, as boring as that is. But they get exposed to all those jobs, and then they end up in them, and we diversify government as well as give people those career ladders. So I'll just throw that one out there.
We could also add the Community Learning Partnership. Many of you in here have been, in meetings and in conversations with Andy Mott, and the idea of having more higher education programs, curriculum majors for community organizing and community change. And UB Social Work School now has their major in that. And I think that there is an opportunity either through New York State or potentially in the long run through federal government to apply more of that and to provide internships for people who are in higher education to learn on the ground of community change. And I know Andy's got a bill in the House of Representatives that would use federal work study money for those kind of internships in higher education programs around community change. So we remain kind of in that network and with an opportunity for seeing how that goes in the future. So we shouldn't let it be off the radar.
And Katie touched on this point, but I think that over the next 10 years we're going to see a blending of the sectors, right?
Yes.
So you have the social sector intertwined with government, intertwined with the private sector. Innovative models that are going to result with that. That's already began as well. You have social enterprises, you have B Corps, impact investing. So it's exciting to see where that goes. And that's ramped up considerably. The B Corps, I think they began back in 2007. So we've been at that for a while, and we're just finally seeing that come to fruition, which is exciting. And then I think it also offers additional opportunity for the attracting talent, right?
Yes.
That bridge between the private sector, and you can bring those folks over and start feeding that pipeline.
Not to mention government subcontracting, the conditions of government subcontracting with not-for-profit organizations. That's a matter of very important policy that the government gets off light on.
Katie and Rusty, I wanna give you the last chance.
Yeah, I think I'd, add to what Curtis said, like, I think just making sure that we have safe spaces across our communities where nonprofits have time to collaborate and innovate and learn together, and both from one another and from experts in the field, and really be able to move things forward in a way through a diversity, equity, and inclusion lens, so that our boards look differently and the people who are receiving services actually have a say in how programs are run and developed, and I think just like more of a community voice in general, both at the community level, the nonprofit level, and the government level.
And so the only other thing I'll add that I didn't mention in the slides is that looking at these data over time, the social sector in Buffalo Niagara is growing. It's growing faster than the private sector. And so rather than just looking at that as a positive outcome, though, I think we uncovered some things in this report that suggest we need to tend that garden, that there are some inequities that we still need to address. And so what we're trying to do is spotlight those issues while also highlighting the fact that it's growing and it's contributing to the public good.
Great. Well, I wanted to thank our panelists.